good morning, or good noon, depending on where you are. Glad to see so many familiar faces here. And we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Janine Vanderberg. I chair the Encore Network Leadership Council, and am very excited to host this conversation today about advocacy. I've felt for some time that as the Encore Network, given our membership really around the world, in different states in the US, that we have the potential of bringing the voices of those that we work with, older workers, older volunteers, older adults in general, to the attention of policymakers, and use our collective voices and the voices of those that we work with towards advocacy for things like better workforce policies, for having people paying attention to things like workplace age discrimination laws, and so many other topics that we've talked about both in programs and in the over 50 plus affinity group. So I'm thrilled to introduce today, and we're going to have Doug Dixon actually introduce the people who are speaking to us, but all accomplished advocates to share some tips on advocacy. That's one of our goals. But more importantly, what I hope is that we leave today with kind of a sense of purpose, that advocacy collectively is something that we can and should take on as the Encore Network, and more specifically, start an affinity group of people who would like to get involved in advocacy, both in their communities and on behalf of the network. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Dixon, co-chair of the program committee, who will introduce not only our speakers, but provide a little overview of advocacy. So Doug, it's yours.
Thank you, Janine, and I'm going to see if this works. Share my screen. Are you able to see that? Yeah. No, I'm going to go back because, okay. Everybody see that?
We do, Doug. You go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you. I thought for a minute that I was on mute because I wasn't hearing anything in response. So as Janine said, the work that we do is often convoluted or affected by things in the system that affect our ability to support the people that people over 55 that we're working to support, whether it's in a job search, whether it's in finding purposeful activity of other sorts. And some of these contortions that we go through are necessary because of the way the system currently functions. But wouldn't it be nice if, and by the way, I love a couple of these images. I love the one where they actually painted the lines around the phone booth, which you think could be moved, or created an improvised air conditioning system for a car. Or I love in particular this image on the bottom right, where you have to, in a pedal operated trash can, stand on one foot and raise the other foot to operate the lid. And of course the message on the bottom, which is don't move the can. So, I think this is illustrative of some of the barriers, some of the issues in the system that we often encounter. So wouldn't it be better if we could actually, along with supporting the people who have to live within this system, actually make changes to the system as well, so that over the long term, we can reduce, even eliminate many of these obstacles. So there's a working definition that we're using for advocacy. It's making the case for and taking action that can lead to change within the system. And those changes have to do with policies, practices, and in some cases, the law. So in the process of taking action, we start with a learning and listening process where we're educating ourselves, but also preparing the way for educating others. And partly that involves understanding what the positions are of others and how we need to shape our message so that it reaches the audiences that we need to reach, the stakeholders that have a position that we need to hopefully change. And then recruiting others to the cause. And then we get to the action phase where we're looking to change public opinion. We're looking to create an environment in which there's a better understanding of the issue. And then actually meeting with the people who are involved, in some cases, lobbying those who who need to be involved in making the change. So that's just a brief primer, and I think with that as a baseline, what we want to do is turn to our panel, and we have three wonderful speakers that will help us understand more about how the advocacy process works from the work that they've done, and also some lessons learned. So we have Karen Brown, who is past president of the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging in Colorado. Karen, can you right there? She is. And Allison Hiltz, who is the State Advocacy Director at AARP Colorado. Allison, there you are. And is Samantha with us? There she is, Samantha Hamilton, who is program manager at Live Well Springfield Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts. So each of them brings a different perspective, a different set of experiences. And we're going to, at the outset, we're going to learn a little bit about their experience, and then we're going to open the conversation to include the rest of us. So to start out, Karen, maybe you can begin by telling us a little bit about your role when you were past president of the Strategic Action Planning Group and how it connected to advocacy.
Well, I actually I've been involved with the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging since its inception, so about 7 years. A part of what we were charged with doing was making recommendations to the state to improve the system to address older adults for years to come. One of the things that we actually did specifically was recognizing that we could only educate. We created something called the Legislative Caucus on Aging, which was our conduit to really connect with the legislature, because many of our recommendations were focused on policies that required legislation. So by having a legislative caucus on aging, we were able to educate those legislators who then could pick up legislation and promote it to their peers during the session. We did choose people from both the House and the Senate, Democrat and Republican on each side, and really across the state. So we had rural representation as well as urban representation. But that was one of the first things that we really actually took a look at, is how do we take our message and our recommendations and connect to policymakers to actually make those kind of changes occur.
Great. And Allison, can you tell us a little bit about your role and how it relates to advocacy?
Yes, so my name is Allison Hiltz. I am the State Advocacy Director for AARP Colorado. So AARP National is the largest nonpartisan nonprofit advocating for older Americans. And then I work mostly on state level issues with the state legislature. So when session starts, which for us is every year, I know some states have every other year. We have a session every year, and we have a team of advocacy volunteers who are experts in various fields, who are also AARP members, and we track all the bills. This year it's over 100 bills that impact older Coloradans, and then get involved to varying degrees, depending on the issue. And they can be anything from, this year we're doing a lot of work around allowing people to go back to work and to fill critical shortages in, say, teaching without losing their pension benefits. We're getting involved in affordable housing. We're involved in utility rate hikes because we know that impacts people on fixed incomes more so. Pretty much any issue I think we could probably connect to older Coloradans in some way, shape, or form. And so as a team, we collectively decide, obviously within AARP's policy priorities, which bills to advocate on. And that can include anything from being on coalitions with other organizations, testifying at the legislature, sending emails, logging in testimony, because we do have both options here still, and that will continue at least through this year. And our advocacy team is still currently virtual, just because we're not quite at the point where everyone's comfortable coming back in. But one of the things we're working on is really expanding our presence more statewide so that we're not quite so Denver metro centric. And so making sure that we have that hybrid option moving forward is something that the team is really working on, because I think there's a lot of issues that you need to have a larger, group at the table to have those conversations. And so that's what we do.
Great. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What's interesting is that Karen and Allison's roles are primarily been at the state level, but Samantha is operating more at a community level. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do, Samantha?
Yes. Samantha Hamilton, LiveWell Springfield Program Manager, and LiveWell is a coalition of community partner organizations that work specifically on policy, systems, and environmental change strategies. Our work in the past was around food access, physical activity, nutrition, and the built environment, how the cities develop the roads and signs and lines in our community. And we've evolved to and pivoted and grow to now be addressing age-friendly cities initiatives and climate change. So my work is involved with understanding what the needs are from a community-based level through assessments and evaluations of what's happening to community residents around issues that affect their health and well-being. Taking that information and developing reports or presentation back to stakeholders and partners that can have a decision-making power on community actions that could be taken, whether it's funding, more policy legislation and or resources or infrastructure development towards that issue. And we do that in collaboration with community organizations and residents that have lived experience around the issue. So it's great to talk about aging and the issues of livability with folks that are experiencing the barriers and limitations for them to age and live well in Springfield. So my goal is to kind of bring the trifecta of research, evaluation, lived experiences, and policy recommendations to decision makers in order to affect community change, and cross collaborate with state partners that are working around aging in the Valley, the western region of Massachusetts, about addressing the issue of aging.
Thank you. So there are a lot of terms that people have put on the table, right? Coalition, cross collaborate, and so on. I think it would help us to understand what this process really looks like in real life. If you could each give us a quick example, a brief example of a situation in which you were involved in an advocacy effort. What were you trying to achieve? What was the process like, and what was the outcome? So Karen, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I'm going to step back a little bit to, again, the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. And one of the initiatives that we really took on was looking more closely at workforce. When SACA first got started, we had a workforce committee, but it was really geared a little bit more towards the direct care workforce, ensuring we had enough people to care for older adults. But we then decided that it was really critical, as we had more people come to our meetings saying, look, we want the opportunity to ensure we have a chance to get work if we need it at 60, 70, or 80. So we really broadened the scope of that. And as a result of that work and our recommendations, we actually approached the Colorado Workforce Development Council, which is our key workforce group in the state, guiding all efforts around workforce development, pitched a presentation, talked specifically about older adults. And in our pitch, we asked for a position on the Workforce Council. We also asked for a task force focusing on the mature worker. Actually, as a result of our presentation, we were allocated a spot on the Colorado Workforce Development Council, looking from the lens of just a 65-year-old person and above, ensuring that the programs that were created and developed were really, thinking about all ages and the 65+ population. We created that task force, the mature worker task force. It actually operated for 2 years, right up until COVID. And then the state became just somewhat occupied with other issues. But the whole purpose of that committee was really to help the Workforce Development Council look at the materials that we're sending out. How can we do a better job of representing older adults that might want to be employed, as well as look at programs that would be beneficial to older adults. And one of the areas we looked at was apprenticeship opportunities. So those were a couple of things that we were able to do. They didn't actually change, they weren't legislative changes, but they were elevating the issue to the critical policymakers at the state level across Colorado.
What I'm hearing in that story is that you set a modest goal, achievable goal. You got it, you got a seat at the table, and now you're in a position to do some other things, some other forms of advocacy. Allison?
Thank you. Yeah, and that work was fantastic. I know AARP was tangentially involved before my time on that. So I came in at the tail end and got to see the success part of it, which was a fun way to start. So we, like I said earlier, we're involved in a lot of different policies. I'll give kind of a twofold example, a win and a not quite win. So we have been, like I said earlier, very involved in the teacher pension issue. We have, like many states across the country, a very critical shortage of teachers, especially in rural areas. And so there were a lot of retired teachers who wanted to be able to go back to work and fill some of those shortages. And there's a similar bill for healthcare workers that's making its way, I think, through the process too. But in doing so, there are limits on how much you can work before you start taking a hit on your pension. And so there were two bills kind of in the same vein that allowed this to happen. And we were very heavily involved in it from day one. So that included, working specifically to make sure it got through committee with testimony and testifying live and in person. We sent out action alerts to our memberships. Kind of talking about some of these issues that are coming up. We're more engaged in social media, I think, than we have been in years past. That's where a lot of lawmakers, they live on social media. That's where they are. And there's a lot to be said for having that public statement in a public forum like that. And so got involved there. And that one moved through the process, pretty easily and seamlessly. But on the flip side, we also are working pretty heavily on another pension bill. And I won't go too far in the weeds, but essentially they didn't put money into the pension fund when COVID hit. And now they're putting that pension money back in. And the debate is whether or not that should also include the lost investment gains that they would have gained had it been invested in 2020. And so that's the $79 million hiccup. And it has gone back and forth, and it's been scheduled and rescheduled, and we've sent out action alerts. We've worked with the folks who are working on this legislation. We've worked, through the sponsors folks on wanting to have this go through intact. And so far, we haven't been able to get that to happen. It seems to keep getting delayed. And, as an advocacy group, we want to see action, right? We want to see things go through the process and pass. Unlike an easy one where it's done and it doesn't pass and it's over, we have been for the past several months, in this give and take and going back and forth on this issue. And I think that the extra hiccup, for consideration, and this is an organizational decision, is that $79 million, without it, is it still something we want to support in that way? And so a lot of stakeholder conversations, very robust conversations, I think, between our group. We have about 15 volunteers, but we do have, of course, some pension experts in our group, which is fantastic because they've all been they did these, this was their career. And so I learned, I think, more from them than the opposite. So that's, I think, kind of a two.
So this is not something that we do by ourselves, right? We're better together in this process, but we also have to be patient, right? It's not necessarily an overnight success kind of endeavor. Samantha, oh, by the way, before you start, I should have said this earlier, but if you have questions from any of these examples or any of the conversation, be sure to enter them into the chat and we'll work those into the conversation. Samantha, do you want to tell us an example that of your experience in advocacy?
Yes, sure. I started about 3 years ago at the Public Health Institute, and my first call to action was to host a summit, an age-friendly summit as part of our Tufts grant. And within that, we were working towards a designation, and cities and towns are now becoming more age-friendly and going towards age-friendly designation. And with that comes the opportunity for additional advocacy and resources for those communities. So I work with community partners, as I said, coalition partners that were working on our age-friendly work. We had a dementia-friendly coalition working on efforts towards a dementia-friendly designation. And then we had a health system, our Bay State Health Center was working on a hospital designation towards an age-friendly hospital system. And within, I think, 90 days or 80, within 9 months, we were able to host a summit in July, declaring Springfield an age-friendly, dementia-friendly, and an age-friendly hospital system community. And these efforts towards becoming a designated cities and towns was the starting point for more efforts towards understanding livability for older adults in the community. Those are collaborative efforts towards pushing forward a designation that could lead to more resources and funding. And now we're in a place, we are networking with other cities and towns around the Valley to look at becoming an age-friendly Pioneer Valley. So with our partner organization, the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, who's working with other folks to become that. And then that speaks to the livability of someone who would want to live in Springfield or another community neighboring and a following community further out, that there's attention and awareness about livability for older adults, and there's resources and services available to them. I'll also add that within this work led to us with these community assessments and understanding the issues of housing and transportation for older adults. We had a conversation with an older adult man of color who shared that he had barriers to accessing housing due to his quarry record. And that one person said that, and then within that conversation, another man said, me too, I'm also experiencing this barrier. I live in a one-room apartment. I do odd-end jobs to pay for the apartment, but I don't have stability in my housing. And then another person said, if it wasn't for my wife, I would be just like these other two gentlemen. And and I can understand what they're going through. So through that assessment process, we decided to investigate more if this inequities exist for other folks. And we did an assessment called the Health Impact Assessment. And we were looking at housing and quarry barriers for older adults. And we found out that more folks, communities of color, have this disparate inequities when it comes to accessing housing. And through that, we made recommendations for the local housing authority to understand what they can do to mitigate these barriers or kind of address them. So, and then those recommendations are being pushed forward now to community action groups that are focused on housing rights and housing advocacy. Some of the recommendations are as simple as the look back period. If an older adult is a part of consideration for housing, why are we looking back 20 years in their history? Let's look 2 to 3. And there's plenty of research that shows older adults are less risk of these barriers. But I say that to say that it starts with this designation, but it led to these assessments of understanding the inequities of a community to find what your policy advocacy issue might be. And that's from a community-based level, that's how we approached it. We took the time to listen, and listening is key to understanding advocacy, on how and what the issues are, to really hear community ground truth is what we call it, to then push forward a report that really shows that this does exist in our community. There's inequities in our community, and there's ways to advocate for older adults living with these barriers. So that's an example in itself. So
and I thank you, and I think the important one of the important points you made was listening to understand the problem, and not writing off a single individual. Right, a single individual can make a big difference in terms of unearthing an issue that we might not otherwise recognize. But I also think it's important to note that part of the solution was also came by listening, right? By hearing people say, this is specifically the issue, and here's what essentially what we need to do to make a difference. So while we're waiting for other questions to come in, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, from your experience, what the lessons learned are. What are the things that you've learned that we can benefit by from hearing about your experience? Samantha, let's reverse the order. Let's shake things up again. Samantha, you want to start?
Yes. So in one of our conversations, we talked about the term older adults and the stigma of not prioritizing issues for older people in communities. And I framed it as, to my son, I'm an older adult. For my mother, she's my older adult. And livability in itself is what we're striving for. So as I'm building out efforts to address aging for older adults in my community, I'm literally building a better community for me and my children going forward. Because if we can solve the barriers of livability for older adults now through advocacy, then we solve it for ourselves when we get older. So when folks feel like this is a conversation for only older folks when they're older, and when that time comes, I'll talk about it, it's a conversation for now. So when we normalize the terms that we're all aging, that's one thing we're doing all the time. And that in retrospect, I'm relatively older than someone in this world, so I am an older adult, then we understand we can always talk about this conversation at any point. And I also learned the value of community voices in the concept of advocacy. In part of our campaign around housing issues for older adults, we did some interviews with folks with lived experience experiencing these barriers, and to have a candid conversation with someone about what does it mean to you. And the retrospect is what we're looking at. Is I'm looking at someone 20 years, 30 years later removed from that history, but still living with the consequences of the action. Because of the issues of barriers and systems that prevent them to have access to other housing and other things. So that voice in our work, that person's lived experience, helps humanize what we are advocating for. So when we have folks with those examples of whether it's employment, I cannot find employment, there's ageism here, they're discriminating against me and not considering that I have the professional capacity, and doors have been shut on me because of this issue, whether it's advocacy in healthcare, whether it's advocacy, like I said, in housing or even transportation. There's someone that has a lived story about why it's important to them that something be done. And within our community, we could find those folks to be our champions, along with our policy legislation, or whether along with our petition, along with our ask, because our ask could look like community change beautification. It could look like a whole system rehab, or it could look like legislation. So I want to frame that advocacy can take many forms, but my takeaway is always bringing the voices of the community to the conversation every time.
And the stories are compelling to the people that we need to endorse or have involved in the change process. Allison or Karen, either one of you want to jump in next?
I can jump in. I'm in the middle either way, right? So when you reverse order, I'm still in the middle. Yes to all of that. The connecting the policy to the people piece is really important because, my background prior to joining here was in elected office. And so I know that regardless of how invested lawmakers are in, policies, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of the details, the funding, the implementation. And so making sure that we're really bringing back the reason for the policy to the people is really important. And I think in my experience, patience is a virtue. It's not one that I excel at, but I'm working on it. It is a longer process. And sometimes that means getting involved and it takes 2 years to get to where you want to be. And so just being involved from the get-go, but also being really open-minded about who you work with, because, in today's day and age, everything is very polarized and it's very easy to say, well, so-and-so wouldn't support this. But, I think at the end of the day, most people have the same goals. It's just a matter of method or avenue. And so having conversations that you can tailor to the people that you're talking to connect with them, and connect that policy to the people is important. In my experience, when I was in elected office, some of our, I would say by and large, our most vocal advocates were older adults. And yet I very, very rarely heard that advocacy connect back to them being an older adult. It was generally issue-based, and there's so much activism and power already in the numbers and the people who were coming to testify, but not necessarily advocating for themselves. And maybe that's from a lifetime of taking care of others as parents and in the workforce, et cetera, whatever that may be. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and just harnessing and embracing that power as a large force there's a lot of opportunities there for change, especially when you start connecting the policies to what's important for older adults. Because despite being in elected office for 4 years, I've learned more about issues impacting older adults in the community in which I served in the short time I've been with AARP than when I was in office, because even when housing came up and all of these issues, it was generally a broader conversation. And so there's just a massive opportunity for some very real change there if we focus in our efforts on the older community.
Great, thank you. Karen? Karen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, just the mute button wouldn't come on.
Oh, that's right.
So a couple of things I would offer is that, and both Allison and Samantha touched on this in some way, but you'll have partnerships or relationships with different bodies. So certainly for us, like having those relationships with the legislators was really important to really help move some of our efforts forward. They are the connectors to the rest of the legislative session and or their parties, and can be instrumental in moving things forward. Additionally, for SAPCA and its collaborative, having relationships with the staffers within state government was also very beneficial, because we made progress on the policy side of the equation a little bit quicker than we did on the legislative side. So for example, Doug, to your point, when we got somebody, we made our presentation, got someone onto our Colorado Workforce Development Council and got the task force, that took us about 6 months, 6 or 7 months. We were involved in some other legislation called the Secure Savings Program, which enhanced retirement savings in the state of Colorado. It took us 7 years. So, you just have to be cognizant that if it's a big issue, it may take longer. If it's a smaller issue, you probably can get it done a little bit more quickly. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we did is we really looked at how do we connect with both parties. Right now the Dems are in control here in Colorado, but you just never know when things are going to change, and different pieces of legislation might be more welcomed by a Republican than a Democrat, or vice versa. The other thing that I would point out too, and again, both Samantha and Allison have touched on this, we are part of something, and actually Allison and Janine and I are part of the Older Worker policy collaborative. So we have a group of more than a dozen different organizations who get together every couple of weeks and talk specifically about legislation that we are trying to move forward outside of SOPCA, or maybe sometimes in combination with our organization. And we've actually kind of focused sort of on those medium-term things that we've been able to accomplish legislatively. So we've actually managed to, through ARPA funding, really get written into our legislation for the workforce development funds, that seniors were in fact a part of the group that needed to have access to the funding, and that programs should be developed around that. We also passed something for earned income tax credit that extended that credit to people 64 and over. These were shorter term things, like a year, maybe 2 years, to make them kind of happen. So just know that sometimes it can be really short, sometimes it could be really long, and it can be all in between. And tenacity and patience, just keep plugging away. Allison often describes herself as delightfully difficult. I, on the other hand, am just difficult. So sometimes it takes kind of all players at the table.
That's right. The carrot and the stick, right?
Right.
So,
so Doug, we're starting to get some questions come
yeah, I
in.
was just gonna ask you. Thank you.
Okay, I agreed I would monitor the chat. So Betsy, hi Betsy, says, interested in advocacy as an individual, and kind of start by finding organizations that are leading this work in her community and volunteer. And she'd appreciate comments from our panelists on how individuals can support your work. What kind of, support when you're looking for, I call us civilians, right? People who aren't professionally attached to something. When you're looking for civilian volunteers, what's useful to you? And that could be anybody. Just go ahead and weigh in.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. I part of our work involves residents. So I have a resident advisory council, and that's intentional to engage civilians, community folks in the conversation around aging. And the expectation is that they participate. We provide stipends for their time to be at the table. And they bring their lived experience and professional experience. So we all have value, whether we're working or not, retired or former skill sets. That can be used in coalition development. So we intentionally are looking for folks to participate in that work. What we offer as a participation is some capacity building, some understanding of what is happening in community, so folks can be informed on how they want to step in a advocacy role. So there's this transformative relationship goal is that folks that are willing to join the work have the ability to, because we've incentivized the process or make it more accessible, but also that they're gaining something from understanding what the issues are in aging. And also they help guide us if they see something in their community about an aging inequities or barrier that's not really talked about. So they can inform us on what to do, where to go. And also they can tell us where is community. I sit in an organization most of the time, and community folks know where are community groups happening, who are folks listening to, who's the informed neighbor or the business partner, mom and pop shop or store that we should go to spread our word, our information. So my intention is always to make the barriers of participation very easy for anyone to come to the table. And then also understand if what I'm looking to address and what they're looking to address are the same goals. And then we can all get to work on once we've got those figured out.
Fabulous. Allison or Karen, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for your state's advocacy team and work on state legislation. Happy to connect you with that person. But, I know for a lot of people getting involved at the state level can be really daunting. And since my background is in local government, I have a really soft spot for local advocacy, especially because it's a lot easier, I think, to really dive deeply into an issue when you're first starting out, and local government tends to be pretty accessible. And so you can really see immediate changes and an immediate impact much more quickly than I think maybe at the state level, depending on that policy. So that's what I would recommend too. I think a lot of what Samantha said is a lot of the same advice that I would give. But again, if you're interested in the statewide legislative advocacy, let me know, because AARP also has, and other folks do too, but tax aid. And I mean, there's a whole slew of different volunteer opportunities to plug into what you want to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be policy work, because it all ties in together, right? So we have livable communities, but you have to have policies that foster livable communities in order to work on livable communities. So it is all very interconnected.
Yeah. Karen.
I would just offer, if you're specifically interested on the workforce side of the equation, every state has some sort of a workforce development council. Those are open to the public to attend. I mean, it's a great place to go and just listen and kind of hear, what are the programs being proposed? What is happening? And you as a person who's just attending as a non-board member have the ability to participate in activities. At least here in Colorado, we have that opportunity. So I would say check out your Workforce Development Council. I would also say I'm guessing that the state of New York has a Commission on Aging. You might check to see if there's a Commission on Aging and if they have some segment targeting workforce. And if they don't, you might even be able to corral a group that would be interested in forming that. Those would be two areas. The other thing I would say is, piggybacking off of what Allison said, is the age-friendly segment. If you have a city or a county that's age-friendly, again, a part of age-friendly focuses on the ability to support yourself, either doing volunteer work, paid work, for as long as you want. So you might be able to connect into the age-friendly infrastructure at the city or county or even state level.
And so I wanted to follow up on that. We had a question earlier about, and Samantha, this may have been for you, how Live Well and Age Friendly was funded. And then I noticed that both you, Samantha, and Allison have put in some links about kind of the network of age friendly communities kind of around the country. But if either of you could speak to funding.
I'd go. Okay, I'll start it off again. Our funding for Age Friendly is through Tufts Health Plan Foundation, now merged with Harvard program, and is now point 32 foundation. So we've received funding for the last 2 years to, one, assess housing and transportation barriers for folks in Springfield, and those priorities came out of a community conversation with the local housing authority groups on what should be focused on if we were to do an assessment. And since then, we've evolved in going a little bit deeper, and now we have another 2 years of looking at developing an age-friendly ecosystem, looking at how we can do healthcare at home options. COVID taught us a lot about healthcare for older adults, and we're looking at what were the innovative ideas that could come out of that we can work with tech partners, health systems, service groups to address that. And we are also championing the age-friendly core barriers for older adults as a policy advocacy. We also received health resources and action funding for our core side of the work. We've kind of worked with community foundations or organizations that prioritize age-friendly initiatives and funding and resources for age-friendly. I think at one point we received a grant from AARP around benches, localized benches in our city. So we're going to put more benches in at bus stops for folks that needed that time to rest. So there's funding out there, and it also should align with their goals and priorities. So that's how we're funded.
Samantha, thank you. And Allison, I know AARP is a big player, obviously in age friendly. Anything you would want to add?
So I put a link in the chat that kind of gives a rundown of all of the different states and how they're structured. But in Colorado, we joined a couple of years ago, and the state committed, I think, $2 billion across multiple departments to impact older adults. And so the age-friendly piece is part of what's called Lifelong Colorado, and that includes a senior advisor in the governor's office to oversee a lot of this, very involved with the strategic action group that Karen was a part of. And then there are multiple different, combination of different organizations and government agencies, so county, getting involved in that work. And I am not the expert on that piece. So if you want more information or more details, I will connect you with our age-friendly person who can get much more in the weeds on it than I can on that funding piece.
Allison, thank you. So I'm going to combine one of the questions, which I then think is a great lead in to the affinity group that we'd like to form. So we're hearing from Chris, any kind of best practices on attracting people to advocacy. And then from Maura, that she would love a conversation around mobilizing older adult advocates to be advocates for our own issue. Allison, earlier said when she was on Aurora City Council, she often heard from older adults, but not necessarily advocating for older adult issues. Do any of you just some best practices on mobilizing advocates? And then Doug, if I can turn it back to you to just talk about kind of forming an affinity group, of which I will be happy to be a part and lead the charge. Yeah, anyone here? Attracting advocates to our cause. Karen.
Janine, I'm thinking, I've forgotten which year it was. Maybe it was last year, 2021 or 2020. But we, in concert with Changing the Narrative, the Older Worker Adult Policy Collaborative, hosted an event focused on age discrimination in the workplace. And if I recall correctly, we had more than 200 people participate in that. And there was just a lot of energy around the issue and wanting to be recognized that, hey, this isn't just me, this really exists. Well, as a result of that forum, we were able to connect with a wide variety of people across Colorado, and I think even some outside of Colorado. So hosting events, that are webinars that talk to the issues that you're trying to secure advocates on, I think that was a great start, because again, we were quite surprised that we got that kind of response, and it was really a pretty short time frame to put it together.
Right. And Karen, and that also reminds me of something Samantha said. The reason we did a webinar on that topic was when we were out in community, people actually weren't talking about long-term care or the kind of things that very often people think are older adult issues. They were talking about, I need a job, I want a job. And so we just kind of put it out there and did this webinar. And I think we were all stunned by the number of people who showed up. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Allison, Samantha, any other kind of tips?
Yeah, I think the point of listening, I think, like Janine, you mentioned that that's what they wanted. That's what the community wanted. And having listening sessions and conversations with community to understand what is happening, what are the barriers, what are you looking to address for older adults, you start there. Because it stems from an authentic place where folks really cared about the issue because they're experiencing it. So workforce development might be a place to start. Healthcare, depending on, might be a place to start with folks because that's their priority need, whether they have chronic health issues that reminds them every day that their health is so important to them, that if we had a advocacy around my health, I would be at the table. And then there's intergenerational care. We are in a sandwich generation, taking care of our younger people, caring for others. So we also can think about, like, there's the caregiver approach. So what are supports for caregiver groups that are advocating on behalf of, or planning for on behalf of their elder parent or family member or assigned, care person. So I would say always listen to understanding what the needs are for your community and start there, because what's unique to Springfield is what's unique to Springfield based on the years of systemic issues that got us to this point. So what's needed in Colorado, geographically totally different community, is not what's going to be needed in your rural suburban community or a city like New York City, where transportation might be a bigger conversation because everybody uses it. And how does that become accessible for all folks, and older adults, have accommodations for them when they are on transit. So that's how that's my best tips, listening and then design, and with community in mind, and with community a part of the plan throughout the process.
Yeah, thank you. Allison, anything to
Yeah,
add?
I think what just doing outreach. Betsy's here saying, how do I get more involved? And you would be amazed by just by asking the question, how many referrals you can get for anything your heart's desires in terms of what kind of policies or areas you want to get involved in. I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we're doing right now is I'm doing a lot of ramping up recruitment efforts for when session ends, because we are a statewide organization, but our representation isn't necessarily reflective of our geographic or racial demographics in the state. And so really making sure that as we're doing that recruiting, we're being mindful of representing the community in which we serve on a statewide basis. And so just asking the question, I think that outreach piece is really important, because if people don't feel necessarily empowered to advocate for themselves as older adults, then you're probably already going to have a harder time getting them to see themselves as an advocate for older adult issues. And so asking people to join goes a really long way, because everyone has a value to bring. And so connecting that value to the work that you're doing, and maybe that's not the work you're doing, maybe that's someone else, and the work that they're doing is a little bit better, fitted. But being mindful of that and making sure that people are in the right place and volunteering and advocating on the right issues that they have passion and feel empowered for, so that they stay more engaged and then want to tell more people to do it. So
Yeah.
it's an ongoing, it's an ongoing thing.
Allison,
There's no
thank you.
one right answer.
Doug, can I turn it back to you now to talk about kind of what's next?
Yes, I first want to say thank you to Karen, Allison, and Samantha for giving us a kind of an advocacy 101, right? And kicking us into action, so to speak. And one of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about before we close is, how do we keep this conversation going, right? We've made a great start. We've all done some advocacy, whether we recognize it as that or not. But how can we do it better? How can we engage more folks in the effort, and so on? So I think we can learn from each other by continuing to connect. And I also think there's an opportunity for us to create a common agenda, so that we can not just learn from each other, but also reinforce the work that each of us is doing in the various areas in which we operate, and hopefully become a fulcrum around which others gather and help us, as our panelists have pointed out, help us grow the coalition so that we can have more impact. So the question is there interest in forming an affinity group that will meet on a regular basis and continue to surface the issues that relate to this, and look at the possibility of coming up with an agenda that we can connect to. So okay, Ray, I see some raised hands, some nods. So the question then is, shall we just schedule a time in the next month or so to get together, and we will come up with a topic, an agenda, and move from there? Let's open the mics. Who has a thought about what the next step might look like?
Well, one of the things I was thinking about, and I don't know if you all are looking at the state level or the federal level, but we do have a Senate committee on aging, a special Senate committee on aging. And it is, I think there's nothing on the House side. They've been in existence since 1961. But that might be like a basic introductory avenue that we could figure out, how do we connect with those members? I think there are about 11 different states, and share more information about our concerns connected to, if it's workforce related, Encore, whatever. I mean, I just throw that out there because I was thinking about it yesterday when I was looking at it going, gosh, I don't think I've reached out to that group one time, but more effort in that direction might be positive. But again, I don't know where your leadership council has thought about this, but that might be one area we could look at federally as opposed to addressing things at a statewide level. So just a thought.
We've got federal, state, and community as potential places to connect. Other thoughts?
I would add to that too, just the segmentation of working with the older population and self-advocacy versus legislators or corporate. So kind of defining the segments and then what are the tools that we need. And I like Karen's idea as a group, we probably have more commonality of the national issues because our communities are so different. And I thank the panel in this conversation because this is not my area of expertise, but it's a critical area for us to be involved in conversations. So anything that we can do to dovetail with work that's going on or help us to know how to be better advocates is greatly appreciated.
Okay, we have time for one final thought.
Moira Allen from Paris. I'm working with an organization here called Old Up, which is really a remarkable organization. And we've just managed to get a tiny little bit of funding from the Paris City Council. And one of the elements that we're going to be developing, and this is where I would really enjoy some input, is to try to work on developing a register of all the organizations that in fact do have the opportunity for people to participate, and to find out whether those opportunities are taken up, and then to start working on that as a groundwork. Because it's all very well saying we're not well represented, but if there are opportunities and we're not taking them up, then it's a bit counterproductive. So that's just one of the aspects that would interest me very much, because I've been listening to what's been said, and there are various councils, and we could perhaps get stimulation from across the ocean and see what's going on. It would be very interesting.
Great, good. Nice to see you, Moira. So I think what we'll do, Janine and I organized this today. I think we'll organize the first affinity group meeting. We'll pick a date, we'll pick a topic, and we will kick it off and see where it goes. How's that sound as the next step? So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kelly. As we always end our meetings, please give us a quick assessment of whether you took away something of value from today's meeting. And while you're doing that, I just want to mention an upcoming event. In May, our program will focus on encore.org. Many of you know that encore.org has made a lot of changes over the last couple of years, including the separation of the Encore network from encore.org. And in May 18th, from 12 to 1 Eastern, 9 to 10 Pacific, we'll get a sneak peek in terms of what they're thinking about next, what their new branding is going to be, which they'll be introducing in the next month. So we'll get a head start on what others will learn when they kick off their new branding in June. So thank you to the Intergenerational Affinity Group for working with Mark Friedman and with Eunice Nichols to plan this program, and hope to see all of you then and there. So the results, look at that, 100%. So thank you again to our panel and to all of you for making this a very informative discussion this morning. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely being with you all.